The journey to Double Earth had been smooth, a testament to decades of technological advancement in interstellar travel. Inside the cockpit of the SS Horizon, Captain Theo Grayson monitored the final descent with a steady hand. The rest of the team sat strapped into their acceleration chairs, their breaths audible in the confined quarters of the shuttle. Outside, the planet loomed larger on their screens, a perfect sphere of swirling blues, greens, and browns, a hauntingly familiar sight that had enthralled humanity ever since its discovery. "Approach vector steady," Theo muttered, his voice gruff but calm. "Atmosphere looks stable. Brace yourselves. Turbulence incoming." Dr. Eliza Harper, the team's xenobiologist, leaned forward in her seat, her eyes glued to the viewport. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. The planet's lush, cloud-covered surface was mesmerizing, yet there was something subtly off about it, something she couldn't quite articulate. Noah Patel, the tech specialist, scoffed from his seat beside her. "Enjoy it while it lasts. We'll probably be knee-deep in mud and alien bacteria in a few hours." His twin sister, Nadia, shot him a withering look. "Some of us do find the unknown exciting, Noah." As the shuttle pierced the atmosphere, the turbulence grew fierce, rattling the crew as they clung to their seats. Outside, the view shifted to reveal sprawling forests, vast oceans, and mountain ranges that shimmered as though coated in precious metals. Rivers snaked like glowing veins across the land, casting an eerie luminescence against the shadow of dusk. "Is it supposed to be this shiny?" Dr. Ayako Tanaka, the team's geologist, asked, frowning at the planet's surface. "Reflectivity like that usually suggests—" "Unstable minerals," Nadia finished for her, her tone laced with curiosity. "Or something alive." The shuttle touched down in a clearing, surrounded by towering, twisted trees that seemed to claw at the sky. The ground beneath them hissed faintly, as if exhaling, and the landing struts sank slightly into a spongy, moss-like terrain. Eliza glanced at the external monitors and noticed the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the ground. "Did anyone else see that?" she asked, her voice taut. "See what?" Theo replied, unbuckling his harness. His sharp gaze swept the cockpit's displays, but nothing appeared amiss. Eliza hesitated. "Never mind." The hiss of the airlock opening sent a thrill down Eliza's spine. As the ramp extended, a wave of dense, humid air poured into the shuttle, carrying with it a cacophony of sounds, chirps, howls, and faint guttural growls that defied easy classification. It was a soundscape utterly alien, yet strangely organic. Captain Grayson led the way, his boots crunching against the soft, mossy ground. The rest of the team followed, their every movement slow and deliberate. Each carried a standard-issue environmental pack equipped with scanners, oxygen reserves, and a sidearm, just in case. Eliza was the last to descend, her eyes scanning the surroundings with equal parts wonder and caution. The forest around them was alive with movement. Leaves on the twisted, gnarled trees swayed despite the absence of wind. Vines snaked up trunks, their tips twitching as if tasting the air. The light filtering through the canopy above shifted unnaturally, bending and refracting in ways that made the trees appear taller, the shadows deeper. "I'm getting energy spikes," Nadia called out, staring at her handheld scanner. "But they're all over the place. No consistent pattern." "Could be magnetic interference," Noah suggested, fiddling with his own device. "Or something in the soil. It's throwing off my instruments, too." Speaking of soil, Ayako said, kneeling to collect a sample. This isn't soil, it's biological. She scraped up a handful of the moss-like material, which released a faint, almost imperceptible hum when disturbed. Eliza crouched beside her, her gloved fingers brushing the moss. "Living ground," she murmured. The material pulsed faintly beneath her touch, a rhythmic beat that matched no natural pattern she recognized. It was as if the ground itself was breathing. "Keep moving," Theo ordered, his tone curt. "We'll set up base camp in the clearing up ahead. No wandering off." By nightfall, the team had established their temporary outpost. A ring of portable lights illuminated their perimeter, casting long shadows across the alien landscape. The forest seemed to retreat just beyond the reach of the light. It sounds quieter now, but no less unsettling. Every so often, a distant wail echoed through the trees, followed by the snapping of branches. Nadia busied herself with cataloging the first plant samples, while Noah set up the communications array. Ayako studied the geological samples they had collected, her face a mask of confusion. "This shouldn't be possible," she muttered under her breath, staring at a rock that appeared to be secreting a viscous, amber-colored fluid. "What's wrong?" Eliza asked, leaning over her shoulder. "These rocks," Ayako replied, tapping the specimen. "They're behaving like biological tissues. Look at this." She pointed to her microscope display, which showed cells dividing and regenerating within the rock. "It's like they're alive." Before Eliza could respond, the lights flickered. The team froze, their gazes snapping toward the forest. "Could be the power grid," Noah said, though his voice lacked confidence. "I'll check it out." "No," Theo barked. "We stay together. Whatever's out there, I don't want anyone separated." The lights stabilized, but the unease lingered. Eliza stared into the darkness beyond the camp, her heart pounding. For the first time since their arrival, she questioned whether they should have come at all. As she turned back toward the camp, she thought she saw movement, a shadow, impossibly tall, slipping silently between the trees. She blinked, and it was gone. "Eliza," Theo called, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Get some rest. We have a long day tomorrow." But as she lay in her cot that night, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them, that it was alive in a way no one could have prepared for, and that whatever it wanted from them, it wasn't peace. The air around the camp grew colder as the second day dawned. A thin mist clung to the ground, wrapping the forest in a damp shroud that muffled sound and obscured movement. Captain Theo Grayson called for an early start, his voice crisp and commanding as he urged the team to push deeper into the wilderness. Their goal was clear: gather enough data to justify their expedition before the strange phenomena of this planet could overwhelm their resolve. Dr. Eliza Harper trailed the group, her scanner gripped tightly in her hand. The device beeped erratically, picking up faint, fluctuating energy readings. She stopped every few meters to examine the underbrush, her sharp eyes noting the unusual behaviors of the flora. Leaves trembled as if responding to her presence, and vines recoiled from her touch, as though the very ecosystem had developed a sentience that defied logic. "Let's keep moving," Theo called, his tone sharp. "We're burning daylight." Eliza nodded and jogged to catch up with the others. She found Ayako crouched over a patch of bioluminescent fungi, her gloved fingers hovering just above the strange growths. The mushrooms emitted a faint rhythmic pulse, their glow intensifying when Ayako moved closer. "It's like they're aware of us," Ayako whispered. She plucked a sample and sealed it in a container. As she rose, her gaze lingered on the forest. "I don't like this place, Theo. It's too deliberate." "Noted," Theo replied, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. "But we're here to observe, not jump at shadows." The group pressed on, their boots crunching against the soft, moss-like ground. The forest thickened around them, the gnarled trees looming like ancient sentinels. Occasionally, they caught glimpses of movement in the periphery, brief flashes of something darting through the underbrush, too fast to identify. The air grew heavier, as though the forest itself were pressing down on them. Hours later, Sergei Volkov, the team's survivalist, halted abruptly. He raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice low and tense. The others froze. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustling of leaves and the distant cries of unseen creatures. Then it came again. A wet, slithering sound, like something dragging itself through the muck. "It's coming from up ahead," Sergei said, his grip tightening on his rifle. He motioned for the group to follow him, his movements calculated and deliberate. They crept forward, their breaths shallow, until they reached a riverbank. The scene before them was grotesque. A massive quadrupedal creature lay sprawled in the mud, its body twisted at impossible angles. Its translucent flesh revealed a writhing network of veins and parasitic worms that pulsed with a sickly green light. The creature's head had no discernible eyes, just a wide, tooth-filled maw that stretched unnaturally across its face. "Is it dead?" Nadia whispered, her voice trembling. "Looks like it," Sergei replied, stepping closer. He prodded the carcass with the barrel of his rifle, and a viscous black fluid oozed from the wound. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of rotting meat and acrid chemicals. Eliza knelt beside the creature, her scanner beeping furiously. "This thing, its anatomy is completely nonsensical. It shouldn't be able to move, let alone survive. Look at the skeletal structure. These bones aren't for locomotion, they're weapons." "Predatory design," Theo muttered. "The whole body's built to kill." As they examined the creature, the forest around them grew eerily quiet. The absence of sound was deafening, and a chill ran down Eliza's spine. She stood abruptly, her gaze darting toward the tree line. "We need to go," she said, her voice urgent. "Something's wrong." Before anyone could respond, the silence was shattered by a guttural roar. The team whirled around just in time to see the creature's body convulse violently. Its chest cavity split open with a sickening crack, and from within, a mass of writhing tendrils erupted, each tipped with barbed, claw-like appendages. The thing lunged towards Sergei with terrifying speed, its movements fluid and unnatural. Sergei fired his rifle, the sharp crack echoing through the forest, but the creature was unfazed. One of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his leg and dragging him to the ground. He screamed, thrashing wildly as the barbs dug into his flesh. The others opened fire, their weapons blazing, but the creature was relentless. It dragged Sergei toward the riverbank, its tendrils slicing through his protective suit like paper. "Get him!" Theo shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The creature submerged itself in the river, taking Sergei with it. The water bubbled and churned for a moment before falling still, leaving only a dark stain where Sergei had disappeared. The remaining team members stood frozen, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Eliza stared at the river, her mind racing. Sergei was gone, taken by a predator unlike anything she'd ever imagined. "We have to get out of here," Nadia said, her voice shaking. "We're not safe." Theo nodded grimly, his face pale but determined. "Back to camp, now." As they retreated, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them, that it had been watching all along. Whatever had taken Sergei wasn't just a predator. It was part of something much larger, something intelligent, and it wasn't finished with them yet. The air around the camp was suffocating by the time they returned. The forest had grown darker, its twisted canopy blotting out the sun. The bioluminescent glow of the moss underfoot was faint now, flickering like dying embers. The team was silent as they secured the perimeter, their faces pale and drawn from Sergei's brutal death. Even Noah, usually quick with a sarcastic comment, worked with a grim efficiency, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out. Eliza Harper sat at the edge of the camp, her scanner clutched in trembling hands. The device had been spiking erratically ever since they left the riverbank, the readings climbing to levels she couldn't comprehend. She turned it off, unable to bear its incessant shrieking, and looked out at the forest. The trees loomed like grotesque statues, their warped branches twisting in unnatural ways. She could swear they were leaning closer, their gnarled forms bending subtly toward the camp. "They're watching us," she whispered to no one in particular. "Who's watching us?" Nadia asked from nearby, her voice raw with exhaustion. She was tending to a gash on her arm, a souvenir from one of the thorny vines that seemed to lash out at her earlier, unprovoked. "The forest," Eliza said, her voice barely audible. She gestured toward the trees. "Don't you feel it? It's not just the creatures, the whole place. It's alive." Nadia glanced uneasily at the trees, but she said nothing. Instead, she returned to cleaning her wound, her movements brisk and mechanical. Captain Theo Grayson paced near the center of the camp, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He hadn't spoken much since Sergei's death, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the perimeter with the vigilance of a predator himself. He stopped abruptly and knelt by a cluster of vines that had crept unnervingly close to the camp's edge. "These weren't here this morning," he muttered, tracing one of the tendrils with his gloved hand. It recoiled slightly at his touch, curling like a startled animal. "They're moving. Of course they're moving," Ayako snapped, her voice tinged with hysteria. She hadn't stopped pacing since they returned, her hands shaking as she clutched a sample vial of amber-like fluid. "Everything here moves. The rocks bleed, the ground breathes, and the damn trees are closing in on us. We're in the belly of something, Theo, and it's digesting us." "Enough," Theo barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We need to stay focused. We've lost Sergei, but we're not losing anyone else. Eliza, any updates from your analysis?" Eliza hesitated, her eyes flicking to the sealed containers of samples they'd collected. The contents pulsed faintly, as if responding to her attention. She swallowed hard. "It's worse than I thought. This isn't just an ecosystem. It's a single organism. The plants, the animals, the soil, everything is connected, part of the same living network." "A hive mind?" Noah asked, his voice trembling slightly. He fiddled with his comms unit, his usual bravado long gone. "No," Eliza said, shaking her head. "It's not separate entities working together. It's one entity, a planet-sized predator." The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into the minds of the team like stones. "What does it want?" Nadia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliza looked at her, her expression grim. "Us. It wants us." The forest answered her unspoken fear. A low, guttural groan resonated through the trees, followed by a series of sharp cracks. The ground beneath them trembled, and the moss began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening like the heartbeat of some massive, unseen beast. Theo raised his rifle, his voice steady despite the chaos. Defensive positions. Now. Before anyone could respond, a tree on the edge of the clearing erupted in movement. Its trunk split open with a wet, tearing sound, revealing a hollow cavity lined with writhing, tendril-like roots. From the opening emerged a mass of spindly appendages, each tipped with needle-like claws. The creature was neither plant nor animal, but something in between. Its body a grotesque amalgamation of wood, flesh, and sinew. It lunged toward the camp with a speed that belied its massive size. Ayako screamed as it grabbed her, its clawed limbs piercing her suit and dragging her toward the hollowed tree. Theo fired, the sharp crack of his rifle echoing through the forest, but the bullets barely slowed the creature. Ayako's screams were abruptly cut off as she was pulled inside, the tree sealing shut around her like a grotesque maw. Nadia stumbled backward, her eyes wide with horror. "We have to run. We have to get out of here." "No," Theo growled, grabbing her arm. "We hold our ground." But the forest had other plans. More trees began to move, their trunks splitting open to reveal similar grotesque creatures. Vines lashed out from the canopy, wrapping around Noah's leg and yanking him off his feet. He clawed at the ground, screaming as the vines dragged him toward the underbrush. Theo fired again, severing the vine, but more sprang forth, their barbed tips glinting in the dim light. Eliza stumbled toward the center of the camp, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the chaos. She looked at her scanner, which was flashing wildly, the readings climbing off the charts. "It's reacting to us," she shouted. "The more we fight, the more it adapts." "Then what the hell are we supposed to do?" Theo roared, his back against the supply crates as he reloaded his rifle. Eliza didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the forest beyond the camp, where the trees seemed to ripple like waves, their movements synchronized and deliberate. It wasn't just the creatures attacking them, it was the planet itself converging on its prey. As another tree split open, disgorging a mass of writhing tendrils, Eliza realized with a sinking certainty that there was no escaping this place. The forest wasn't just alive, it was a predator, and they were already inside its jaws. Eliza Harper could barely breathe. Her oxygen reserves were low, and the air around her was thick with spores that clung to her suit and filled her mask with a sickly, sweet stench. Her legs ached, each step through the pulsating, mossy terrain more laborious than the last. Behind her, the forest moved. Not the creatures, those horrifying amalgamations of flesh and flora, but the forest itself. The ground heaved in slow, deliberate waves, as if the planet was exhaling, drawing her deeper into its suffocating embrace. She was alone now. Nadia had been the last to fall, her screams still ringing in Eliza's ears. The vines had taken her, their barbs piercing her skin and dragging her into the canopy, where shadows consumed her. Theo had gone before that, swallowed by one of the monstrous trees. He hadn't screamed. He'd simply stared at Eliza as the bark closed around him, his rifle useless against the enormity of what they faced. They had come to this world to understand it, to study its ecosystem, its life forms. But the truth was more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. Double Earth wasn't a home for life. It was life, a singular, unified organism, evolved not to coexist, but to devour, to assimilate everything that dared to touch its surface. Eliza stumbled, her boot catching on a root that writhed beneath her like a snake. She fell hard, her visor cracking as it hit the ground. For a moment she lay still, her breath fogging the fractured glass. She could feel the pulse of the ground beneath her, a steady, rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of her own heart. No, not her heart, its heart. The realization struck her like a physical blow. The forest wasn't just hunting her, it was connected to her. Every step she took, every breath, every heartbeat, it knew. It had known from the moment they landed. A low groan echoed through the trees, a sound that resonated deep in her chest. Eliza pushed herself to her knees, her hands shaking as she scanned the horizon. The clearing was close, the faint outline of their shuttle just visible through the shifting shadows. If she could reach it, if she could get to the ship and launch, there was a chance she could escape, a chance she could warn the others back on Earth. But the forest wasn't going to let her go. The ground around her began to split, thin tendrils snaking up through the cracks and coiling around her boots. She screamed, slashing at them with her survival knife, the blade biting into the fleshy, plant-like material. It recoiled, but more rose to take its place, thicker and stronger. She slashed again, her movements frantic, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Her calm crackled in her ear, the static broken by a faint, distorted voice. "Eliza?" She froze. The voice was familiar, impossibly so. "Theo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Help us." The voice was faint, garbled but unmistakable. "It hurts." Tears blurred her vision. "Theo, where are you? Another voice cut in, softer, more urgent. "Eliza, it's Nadia. Don't stop. Run." She looked around wildly, her grip tightening on the knife. "Nadia, how are you? Run!" The voice screamed, and the ground beneath her erupted. A mass of tendrils burst forth, their movements impossibly fast. Eliza screamed as they coiled around her legs, pulling her toward a gaping maw that had opened in the earth itself. She fought, her knife slashing wildly, but it was futile. The tendrils were too strong, too many. They tightened around her, crushing her ribs, her lungs, her... She stopped. The tendrils weren't crushing her. They were probing her, sliding under her suit, pressing against her skin. They were warm, almost gentle, as if tasting her. No, she thought, not tasting, reading. Images flooded her mind, alien and incomprehensible. She saw a vast network of roots stretching deep into the planet's core, a pulsing nexus of energy and thought. She saw creatures born and consumed, their forms broken down and repurposed in an endless cycle of life and death. She saw herself, her team, their bodies transformed, their minds absorbed into the network. The forest wasn't just alive, it was sentient, and it was hungry. With a primal scream, Eliza wrenched herself free, the knife in her hand glowing faintly with the alien fluid that now coated it. She stumbled toward the clearing, her vision narrowing, her breath ragged. The shuttle loomed ahead, its hull glinting faintly in the pale light. She reached the ramp and slammed her fist against the control panel. The door hissed open, and she staggered inside, collapsing onto the cold, metallic floor. Her hands fumbled for the controls, her mind racing. The ship groaned as it powered up, the engines whining in protest. Outside, the forest surged forward, a wall of writhing limbs and tendrils. It moved as one, the planet itself rising to consume her. Eliza screamed as the first tendrils reached the ship, slamming against the hull with a force that rattled the entire structure. Come on, she muttered, her fingers dancing over the controls. The engines roared to life, the ship shuddering as it lifted off the ground. She felt the pull of gravity as it ascended, the forest shrinking below her. For a moment, she thought she'd made it. She thought she was free. Then she saw it. The amber fluid, the same viscous substance they had encountered in the forest, was spreading across the interior of the ship. It oozed from the walls, the floor, the controls, pulsing faintly as it crept toward her. She stared at it, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. The planet had already infected the shuttle. Her breathing slowed, her mind numb as the realization sank in. There was no escape. Not really. The forest would take her no matter where she went. With shaking hands, she opened her journal and scrawled a final message. The ink bled onto the page, her words trembling but legible. To anyone who finds this, Double Earth is not a place to study. It is not a place to visit. It is not a place to survive. It is alive. And now so am I. As the amber fluid reached her boots, Eliza closed her eyes, her final thoughts not of fear, but of the forest, of its beauty, of its hunger, of its infinite, inescapable design. The ship's engines roared as it disappeared into the atmosphere, carrying its cargo of death back toward the stars.